Hello and welcome to Future Self Dreaming. My name is Carlos Kukulkan. Today I want to touch on a topic that I'm passionate about that has been growing in the awareness of popular culture through information spread on social media, that being the relationship between people who have internalized codependent tendencies in relationship to those who display deeply embedded traits of narcissism. These dynamics are often referred to as the relationship between the empath and the narcissist, personality traits that are diametrically opposed and generally operating at opposite ends of a spectrum to one another. To begin to understand the distinctive relationship dynamics formed between individuals who embody traits associated with codependence and narcissism, it's helpful to have an understanding of what these concepts refer to. Codependence is actually a term that originated from the developments made in the 1970s in attempting to treat individuals with issues of dependence upon alcohol and other drugs. Therapists noted the benefits of working with the family system in treating these people. However, they also noticed that there were characteristics specific to those partners and family members who were intimately connected to people with substance dependency issues, and so these partners became known as co-dependents. Nowadays, the term is more associated with people who are deemed to be dependent on others in relationships for their sense of self. People who relate to the concept and identity of being an empath often display characteristics of those with deeply entrenched codependent tendencies in their relationships with others. Their extreme sensitivity to the emotional states of those around them often makes codependent types hypervigilant to responding to the needs of others. This is often a preemptive protection mechanism from triggering deeply internalized shame responses. As I've mentioned in previous presentations, the concept of being empathic is not simply the sense that you personally feel what another is feeling, which may actually be more of a form of hypervigilance. It is also not a process of mind reading what you think the other person needs. Empathy may be better described as the capacity to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, see things from their perspective, and be able to listen in a non-judgmental manner that can provide the sense of being understood. The development of empathy is largely a learned behaviour that may come from a combination of care having been provided, as well as the capacity to look at perspectives other than one's own. There are many common characteristics of those with codependent traits, such as people-pleasing behaviour, denial of personal needs, lack of healthy boundary setting, and nice guy behaviour. One of the tendencies that codependents mistakenly think is that if they care for the needs of others, that they will in turn be guaranteed the return of respect, care, love, and admiration that they adorn upon others. Unfortunately, this is sadly not the case, largely due to a poor sense of themselves, often resulting in them tolerating emotional, physical, and psychological abuse rather than setting healthy boundaries for themselves and acknowledging personal needs. It can be a very painful and arduous road to recovery when coming to terms with being the victim of narcissistic abuse. We may need to work through lots of the false introjected narratives that we've taken on about ourselves that overwhelm us. During this period of transformation, there may be the need to get away from the unhealthy relationship dynamic and create a container for your own alchemical inner transformation. It can be challenging coming to terms with not just identifying with being a very sensitive personality type, but actually recognizing the deeply embedded response programs to shame about yourself that need unraveling and transformation. Many people will repeat unhealthy cycles time and time again until they begin to recognize that they are the common denominator in their relationship dynamics that allow the continual perpetuation of disempowerment and abuse within relationship to others. I've mentioned the concept of recovery in previous presentations and pointed out that what we are generally recovering from is a loss of a healthy sense of self due to childhood conditioning. For codependent types, complex post-traumatic stress responses generally become reawakened through relationships and interactions with narcissistic personalities, as they attempt to allow themselves to be vulnerable in relationship and open their hearts and let down their defenses with very toxic personalities who will be damaging for them. Some of the keys to resolving and coming to resolution with codependency are a result of developing a healthier relationship to the self, developing healthy personal boundaries, working through our attachment styles and those triggering responses so that we come into a more secure relationship within ourselves and our relationship with others. Working with unresolved emotional patterning and negative beliefs about oneself can recover a sense of self that was whittled away during early years, partly due to our personal boundaries having been repeatedly crashed. Recovery of the inner child is essential, as is an reintegration of parts of the self that have been fragmented within the psyche, causing conflict and inner turmoil. The positive news for those identifying as empaths or codependents is that statistically recovery is very possible for them, whereas those with heavy traits of narcissism, statistically it is highly unlikely that they will heal or recover from their traumatic injuries. Those with narcissistic personality disorders have developed such a false sense of self that they don't generally recognize that there is anything wrong with them or that they may need to change. The term narcissism comes from the Greek myth about Narcissus, who was a handsome youth who rejected the desperate advances of the nymph Echo. This caused Narcissus to fall in love with his own reflection in a pool of water. Those displaying narcissistic traits associated with personality disorders, as defined in the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual of Psychiatric Disorders, display characteristics of self-obsession, manifesting as an excessive sense of importance and superiority. They are emotionally dramatic, displaying attention-seeking behaviour. They have a grandiose sense of self-importance. They often live in a fantasy world that supports their delusions of grandeur, having a constant need for praise and admiration. They may fluctuate between a victim and tyrant dynamic. They have troubled relationships, a sense of entitlement, lack of empathy, which allows them to exploit others without guilt or shame, and they are frequently demeaning, intimidating, bullying, and belittling of others. The person will have an unstable and intense emotions and distorted self-image. Narcissism is part of a developmental phase that healthy individuals grow beyond as we develop into functioning members of a family and larger society. Small children are naturally selfish as a normal part of normal development, in which they manipulate to get their needs met and cannot yet understand other people's needs and desires. Then, as teenagers, adolescents are typically self-centered as they struggle for independence. Although there may be some genetic factors involved, it's generally recognized that trauma stunts the healthy development of an individual, leaving them stuck at an early developmental stage in which they are self-absorbed and manipulative, lacking the empathy to see people's viewpoints or suffering. The concept of narcissistic rage is a psychological construct that describes a reaction to narcissistic injury, which is conceptualized as a perceived threat to a narcissist's self-esteem or self-worth. Often simply setting a boundary with this type of personality by saying no can trigger a rage response in the same way that a 2-year-old may have a tantrum if they do not get their own way. Narcissistic injury is a cause of distress and can lead to dysregulation of behaviors such as narcissistic rage. Narcissistic supply is a concept used to describe a type of admiration, interpersonal support, or sustenance drawn by an individual from his or her environment, and it's essential to their self-esteem. People with narcissistic personality disorders at their core are deeply fragile beings who need attention from others to emotionally regulate their sense of themselves. Their storytelling and narratives that they convince others about need to be believed and affirmed to support their false sense of self that they have created to protect themselves from core shame that they never want to go near. Children need healthy attention and healthy boundaries to develop into well-adjusted adults. Attention and being witnessed by primary caregivers is essential to the development of healthy self-esteem. When this is not provided adequately and trauma is experienced, it can lead to attention-seeking behaviour later in life as a means to have needs met. For the narcissistic personality, even negative attention is preferable to no attention at all. These personalities often have a Jekyll and Hyde quality. They can be very charismatic in the life of the party, but then also be nasty and vindictive to trigger guilt and compliance in victims of their narcissistic spells. As mentioned, there isn't currently a lot of hope for recovery for those with narcissistic personality disorders. Dialectical behaviour therapy is about the only modality useful in assisting one common form of narcissistic disorder known as borderline personality. This is characterized by extreme fear of abandonment, unstable relationships, extreme mood swings, and self-harm. Thankfully, there are a plethora of resources about this topic available via books and the internet. For those interested in understanding this topic further and healing from codependency and narcissistic abuse, I highly suggest the work of Richard Grannon, who goes by the title of the Spartan Life Coach on YouTube, and his website by that title. Richard does interviews with an invaluable resource named Sam Vaknin, who wrote the book titled Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, and also has a YouTube channel. Richard has a course in healing from traumatic emotional flashbacks that are awakened from narcissistic abuse, and he regularly references the work of Pete Walker in his book titled CPTSD, From Surviving to Thriving, in relation to healing these flashbacks. Another resource is Ross Rosenberg, who can also be found on YouTube, and who wrote the very informative book titled The Human Magnet Syndrome, Self-Love Deficit Disorder, which identifies the entwined relationship dynamics between the codependent and narcissistic personality types. Melody Beattie's book titled Codependence No More is a timeless classic on this topic, as is the work of John Bradshaw in his many books, including that titled Homecoming. A book that I've also enjoyed is called Taming Your Outer Child by Susan Anderson. And 3 other channels on YouTube I would suggest to watch on the subject include Lisa Romano, Vital Mind Psychology, and Inner Integration. I hope you may have gained something of value from this presentation. For more episodes of Future Self Dreaming, please hit the subscribe button. Information about booking counselling and life coaching sessions and workshops can be found via the website futureselfdreaming.com, and you can follow Future Self Dreaming on Instagram and Facebook. In Lakesh.